Welcome, everybody. It's me, Dr. Sean Broyles again. I'm sitting here in my Fortress of Solitude. Behind me is the flag of the glorious Greek nation, and that's fitting because today we're going to be talking about nationalism. However, let me get the sort of nitty gritty out of the way first. You may have noticed, if you look on your course page here, that this is a test week. Because you have a test, and that test is chapters 15 to 21, you can read it below. This is an online class, but it is a take-home test, as in there's no time limit. It's due, well, there is a time limit. It's due at the end of the week when everything else is due. But there's no, once you begin the test, there's no limit to it. I will be reading your answers carefully to make sure that you've actually been reading the book, but I would also like you to go do your own independent research because the questions I'm asking in the book and the terms I'm making you define cover the themes of all the chapters that we're talking about. Because we're doing this test and because it is a big test and I do expect big, thorough answers, I didn't want to load you guys down with too much this week. However, we do need to talk about Napoleon. He's a problem. Let's talk about him. We need to talk about Napoleon and industrialization. So I would highly suggest that before you watch this video that you go and you read the chapters for this week. I think chapters 20 and 21. If not, that's fine. Well, it's not fine that you don't read them. If you don't, this is an online class. If you don't read the textbook, you're going to have a bad time. So, about Napoleon. If you'll notice, one of the assignments that I've put below is an assignment about the Napoleonic Code. So, whenever Napoleon takes over France in 1799, 5 years later, he has himself crowned emperor, and he adorns upon himself. Napoleon has this sort of complex legacy because he exists both as a product of the revolution and obviously a big fan of keeping some of the greatest ideas of the French Revolution. And indeed, he goes around Europe establishing other sort of like revolutionary governments. However, he also represents something that is arguably more tyrannical and more authoritarian than the Ancien Regime, which he overthrew. And in this way, Napoleon represents this sort of halfway between what was left behind and what the revolution promised to be. And in many ways, he was much worse than what the revolution ultimately gave in the end. I really, by the way, I enjoyed reading your responses this last week about the legacy of the French Revolution. And I'm glad I didn't get some simple 2D idea of, oh, well, the French Revolution is all good and amazing, because that's usually sort of what you get in this class. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind as you are reading these things, as you're going through, is I want you to think that Napoleon was a man of his time. He wanted to be perceived. He was not only a great man, he wanted to be perceived as a great man. And a great man of this time was classically educated. He was not necessarily. However, he still loved he was still fascinated with the classics. That I jokingly say they're all Greece and Rome weebs. And indeed, during this time, every man from the founding fathers to the King of England to Napoleon himself are all Greece and Rome weebs. They see Greece and Rome as the height of Western civilization, worthy of emulation. And you see that very much in Napoleon's government. So whenever he takes power, what does he name himself? He names himself First Consul, which is a Roman title. It's an ancient title for Caesar, the triumvirate, given by Octavian Augustus to himself. Sorry, I also teach this Rome class, even though I need to freshen up on it. I need a refresher course. But taking on Roman titles is not the only thing he does. You may notice if you go through, and you'll notice that below there's the Napoleonic Code assignment. So I basically gave you a copy of the Napoleonic Code, and I'm going to ask you in an assignment below, it's worth 50 points, I'm going to ask you some questions about what's happening in the Napoleonic Code. Like, so somebody steals something from you. What does the code say to do about it? One of the things you may notice is that the code really, really pushes back some of the gains that were made by women during the Revolution, few that they were, especially during the Terror period. This is a callback to that ancient Roman legacy. So another thing that Greece and Rome weebs were really big on was Roman morality. And one of the central pillars of Roman morality was something called the pater familias. That, if you speak Latin, that means the father of the family. Now, in its harshest form, this meant that the oldest male had absolute authority over all the other members in his family, up to and including being able to kill them if they displease him. Now, Napoleon doesn't go quite this far. If you notice and look in the code, a son who disobeys his father can be imprisoned. He can't be killed. It's still illegal for a father to kill his son, and uxoricide obviously is still illegal. Uxoricide is murdering one's wife. But you can see things like this as callbacks to Rome and compromises with the revolutionary spirit, but establishing that there's clearly authority now. One of the reasons why Napoleon rises to power is because he doesn't completely repudiate the revolution. However, he is a return to the stability of conservative politics. And after spending several decades in the tumult of revolution and radical reform, this was often seen as very comforting to people, to have normalcy brought back into their lives. In many ways, you could say it was an answer to the excesses of the revolution. So, leaving that behind, well, not completely leaving it behind, another theme that's in your next chapter, in chapter 21, is about nations and nationalism. Now, a whole lot of ink has been spilled on this issue, and a whole lot of people have made a lot of very large sweeping claims about people and human nature whenever it comes to the issue of nationalism. I have my own theories, and I will tell you my own theories, but I've also presented you with the theories of probably the most widely distributed man the most widely distributed man's thought on the issue, and that's the scholar Benedict Anderson. He wrote a book called Imagine Communities, and if you watch this YouTube video, you'll get more into what he thought. So he's really big on the idea that the printing press and the establishment of the printed word is this common medium, so this distribution of mass media, it allowed the standardization of language, and it allowed for the foundations of nationalism to be built. So for instance, a key part of 19th century nationalism is that you get a farm boy in Avignon who has never met a blacksmith's apprentice in Paris, and you have to convince them to join the same organization, the army, put on the same uniform, and die for the same cause. And if you're going to convince people to do that, whether you're in France or whether you're in America, convincing some poor Texas boy to join the same cause as some New York City dweller, you're going to have to construct something pretty compelling and pretty romantic. You're going to have to foster a sense of common identity. Now, there's a temptation in this. There are temptations on either side. So on one side of the nationalism debate, if I want to frame it that way, you have things like primordialism. This is the idea that nations are inevitable and that they're natural and it's just a part of the human experience and they're bound to blood. This obviously sort of bleeds very easily into things like racialism. You have guys like Oswald Spengler, who is a German scholar writing in the early 20th century, who's very big on this theory of nationalism. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have what I would say is probably the most widely accepted theory of nation today. It's not a theory I buy into, by the way. I think it's absolute nonsense. And that's that it's not simply that nations are constructed, but that they must be deconstructed because they are constructed, and constructs are functions of power and oppression. This comes from a lot of things. There are some scholars in the 60s named Peter Berger and Luckman who write a book about the social construction of human society. Whenever you hear somebody going on about X and so as a social construct, they're usually sort of inciting the spirit of this argument. Now, the problem with that argument is that yes, human societies generate social constructs, and it appears as if we really, really need them. There is a parable, it's called Chesterton's Fence, from a philosopher, G.K. Chesterton, and he supposes that somewhere in the middle of nowhere there is a fence, a boundary, and a man comes along and says that he just wants to tear it down because he's a liberal and he believes that all boundaries are nonsense and inherently oppressive to the individual. And the reply to him is that you should know why the fence is there first before you tear it down. And if you want to tear it down after you've interrogated its existence, then I will allow you to tear down the fence. And that's a really good way to approach things like nationalism. We've gotten into this mode and sort of this detached, hovering above reality, sort of academic philosophy and sociology, where it's easy to be glib about the nation state. It seems very obvious that the nation state is constructed, but I hate to tell you this, so is money. Money is a social construct, and yet go and try to pay your rent in Jacques Derrida. The family is a social construct, but it seems essential for the functioning of healthy human beings. And indeed, if you sort of deny people their families from a very young age, it's going to lead to all sorts of mental pathologies, and they'll have a very, very bad, unhealthy life. I'm not saying nations are as natural as, say, a family. It's obvious that nations are constructed. However, it seems obvious that for us to interact with each other, we need some amount of abstraction of institution to make us pro-social. It's a process of bonding. So we can have these sort of large, diverse Western societies so long as we accept that there's a higher identity above us. To put it in probably the most obvious form in the context in which we live now, it's that you can be any race or speak any language, but as long as everybody sort of vaguely accepts that they're all Americans and they're willing to buy into that concept of nation, then you have a stable society with a little bit more high social trust and social altruism. It seems as if we need these concepts to move on. However, it also seems obvious that these concepts can be used oppressively. Much like any other thing in human life, a thing can be both a tool of salvation and a weapon. And I view nationalism in the same way. I think the way we've interpreted the legacy of World War II has given nationalism a very bad name, and we tend to be far too judgmental on the impulse to engage in love of one's nation. So anyway, with that in mind and everything I've just said, I want you to read your chapter 21. I want you to think about what is nationalism, what is liberalism, why was liberalism, which is basically market individualism, why was liberalism so in support of nationalism in the 19th century? And strangely, it seems to be very sort of anti-nationalistic now. It's a topic for a different time. But I want you to read and I want you to think about nationalism. And then I want you to meet me below and answer the questions. And then once you take the test, as a part of next week, I'm going to further this nationalism discussion. And I want you to think about, while you're reading, I want you to think about a nation, whether it's like Mazzini in Italy, or like Otto von Bismarck in Germany, or someone in Russia. I don't do Russian history. I should know who I'm talking about in Russia, right? If you can't tell, I do these videos sort of in the first go. But I want you to think about a nation while you're reading, and I want you to think about their experience with nationalism. I want you to keep that in mind because it's going to be a part of an essay project that we're going to do next week. So if you have any questions, email me. I'm really, really proud of all your work. All of you are doing an incredibly good job. And if you have anything, just let me know. All right. Good luck on the test. You're all doing great.